December 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A heavy blanket of snow lay across the pines and frozen mud, muting footsteps and muffling distant sounds. A bitter wind whipped through the branches, carrying with it the sharp scent of smoke, gunpowder, and frozen earth. Private First Class Tommy Caldwell, 22, hunched over a small portable radio, the SCR 300, strapped to his back. Frost crept across his uniform, and his breath came in white puffs that vanished into the cold morning air. Tommy wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was just another soldier, a radio operator trained to relay messages, monitor communications, and pray that the chaos of war didn't break the fragile chain of command. But chaos had already arrived. The platoon Tommy was attached to had been advancing toward a small village, Bourg-sur-Lace, part of a critical supply route the Allies needed to secure before the German counteroffensive could strike. Hours earlier, scouts had reported enemy movements nearby. The Americans were supposed to have air support and artillery, but dense fog and snow had grounded planes and slowed reinforcements. Now the Germans were approaching from 3 directions. Their armored vehicles rumbled in the distance, and the first volleys of artillery had already shredded the trees on the outskirts. Men lay flat behind fallen logs and wrecked supply crates, frozen, terrified, and waiting for what seemed inevitable. Tommy's commanding officer, Lieutenant Harris, shouted over the wind, trying to coordinate with other units. But the radios were failing. Interference crackled through every channel. Orders were delayed, repeated, distorted. One wrong transmission and the enemy would know exactly where the Americans were pinned down. Tommy adjusted the dials, squinting at the static-filled display. He could hear fragments of messages from headquarters, coordinates, warnings, half-formed instructions. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable. Then, through the hiss of snow and static, Tommy made out a faint call. Alpha 2, confirm artillery support. The rest was lost. He froze for a moment, heart hammering. He knew the artillery could turn the tide of this skirmish. One well-placed barrage could stop the German advance. One wrong move could annihilate his platoon. And there was no time for protocol. Every instinct in Tommy screamed, act fast. He remembered the secondary frequency, the one rarely used but monitored by artillery units for emergencies. It was risky. If the Germans intercepted it, they would know exactly where the Americans were dug in. But he had no choice. Lives depended on speed, improvisation, and courage. Hands numb from cold, Tommy keyed the transmitter, his voice cutting through the static like a blade. Artillery, this is Private Caldwell. Coordinates 47.32 north, 5.84 east. German armor advancing on the village. Immediate support required. Repeat, immediate support. Static. Silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. Around him, the platoon's men exchanged fearful glances. Some whispered prayers, some stared at the ground, gripping rifles as if their life depended on the wood and steel in their hands. Then, far away, faint but unmistakable, the deep, rolling thunder of artillery answered him. It wasn't immediate. The snow swallowed the sound, distorted it, but it was coming. Tommy felt the tiniest spark of hope. It was fragile, like ice underfoot, but it was real. He stayed on the radio, adjusting, recalibrating, repeating coordinates, guiding the guns with precision he didn't know he had. Every adjustment, every whisper through the static was a calculated risk. One misstep could mean friendly fire, disaster, death. But Tommy had trained for this. Not enough to be a hero, perhaps, but enough to survive. And then it began. The ground shook as the first rounds hit the enemy position. German armored vehicles were disabled, machine gun nests silenced. The attackers faltered, confused, retreating under the unexpected hail of American fire. The platoon's men lifted their heads, wide-eyed, astonished. Tommy, still crouched behind the wreckage, barely dared to exhale. He had no time for pride. There were still threats. There were still men who could die. But for the first time, a small, almost imperceptible shift occurred. The tide of the skirmish, fragile as it was, had turned.
The first salvo echoed in the valley, shaking snow from the trees and sending up clouds of frost from frozen earth. German troops scrambled, shouting orders, their rhythm fractured by the unexpected bombardment. Tommy stayed low, his fingers tightening around the radio, adjusting the dials, feeding the artillery precise corrections. Every second counted. Lieutenant Harris crawled over to Tommy, his breath steaming in the cold. Where are they hitting? Are they hitting the village? Tommy's eyes darted to the coordinates on the map, then back at the advancing enemy. Not yet, I'm correcting, just a little to the west. Wait, now. Another explosion cracked the sky. A German half-track skidded sideways, smoke curling from its engine. Soldiers around it dove for cover, some screaming in confusion. The platoon's men couldn't believe what they were seeing. The sudden artillery fire had transformed the battlefield. Where just moments ago they had been huddled, waiting for death, now they saw an opening. Harris gritted his teeth. Hold them. Push forward when I say. Caldwell, keep them on target. Tommy's voice was steady, almost calm, despite the chaos around him. Adjusting. At 50 meters north, impact in 3 seconds. Good. Repeat. Good.
Tommy didn't answer. He couldn't. Magic had nothing to do with it. Hours of training, countless simulations, nerves of steel, and a single decision to act quickly, without waiting for permission, had created this moment. The Germans, momentarily disoriented, tried to regroup. Officers shouted in harsh German, rallying men, but Tommy could see their hesitation. They hadn't expected this level of precision without a forward observer in sight. They didn't know that a single American radio operator, crouched behind debris and shivering in the snow, had become their worst nightmare. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Tommy relayed coordinates tirelessly, his fingers raw from the cold, his voice cracking with fatigue. Every time the enemy moved, he adjusted the fire. Every movement of his own platoon, he calculated, guiding them safely through the chaos. Somewhere down the line, the artillery commander shouted into his own radio, voice booming with excitement. "Spotter, you're a genius. Keep feeding me those coordinates." Tommy allowed himself a fraction of relief, but didn't lower his guard. He saw the terror in the German eyes, but he also saw the fear in his own men. They trusted him, relied on him, and he would not fail them. Then, as the morning sun began to glint off the snow-covered rooftops of Berg sur Lesse, the German advance faltered completely. Tanks bogged down in frozen mud, infantry pinned, morale crumbling. The Americans pushed forward, rifles raised, cautiously reclaiming ground they had feared losing. Tommy's voice cut through static one last time. "All units, target neutralized. Hold position, prepare for counterattack. Artillery, stand by for further instructions." He finally allowed himself to breathe. Around him, his platoon cheered quietly, muffled by the snow and wind. Harris slapped him on the shoulder. "Caldwell, you just saved a lot of lives today. That was incredible." Tommy nodded, still crouched, exhausted, every muscle aching. He didn't feel heroic. He felt responsible, alive, lucky. And for the first time that morning, he allowed himself to glance at the village below. Smoke rising, villagers peeking from windows, untouched streets. It wasn't victory, yet. But it was survival. In those few minutes, a small battle had turned entirely because one man had made a choice to think quickly, act decisively, and trust his training. The rest of the day would be long. The Germans could regroup, reinforcements might come. But in that moment, under the frozen sun of December, a single radio operator had tilted the scales. And history, even if quietly, had begun to notice. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a hushed silence over the battlefield. Smoke drifted lazily from burnt-out vehicles, curling into the pale winter sky. Tommy, still hunched over his radio, finally allowed himself to stretch, feeling every muscle protest. Around him, the platoon began moving cautiously, checking trenches, mud, and footprints for signs of the enemy. Lieutenant Harris walked beside him, surveying the scene. "I've never seen anything like that. You kept them pinned while we regrouped. You save a lot of lives, Tommy." Tommy gave a tight-lipped nod. Words felt unnecessary. The adrenaline still pulsed through him, his ears ringing from the artillery. The reality was heavier than praise. It was a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and lingering fear. Every time he glanced down at the village, he saw children cautiously emerging, peeking around corners. Elderly villagers moved to retrieve what little food and supplies they had left. Private Jenkins, still shivering, approached Tommy, eyes wide. "I thought we were done for. You saved everyone." Tommy shook his head. "No, we saved ourselves. I just pointed the way."
Even as the Americans began to consolidate their positions, the German soldiers regrouped farther back, their morale shattered, but their numbers still dangerous. Tommy knew that the reprieve was temporary. Yet, in those quiet moments, there was something almost surreal about the contrast. The devastation around them and the fragile life of the village untouched. Later, in a makeshift command post inside a partially destroyed farmhouse, the platoon gathered. They warmed themselves with mugs of thin coffee, sharing rations and small talk. Laughter was rare but genuine, broken through by the occasional shudder at the memory of bullets whizzing past. Tommy sat slightly apart, scribbling in his notebook. Coordinates, observations, corrections, records of what had happened, what had worked, and what could have been better. He rarely wrote about the fear or the small guilt he carried over lives that had been lost. Not yet. That weight, he knew, would come later. Harris leaned over the table. "I want you to come up with a plan for tomorrow. Reinforcements might hit the outskirts. We need your calculations ready before dawn." Tommy's pen hovered over the page. He could feel the responsibility pressing down harder than the snow or the cold. But he also felt something unexpected, a clarity. In that moment, he realized that quick thinking wasn't just about reflexes or technical skill. It was about understanding people, anticipating fear, and trusting that a small decision could ripple into something far larger. Outside, the villagers were emerging more confidently. Women carrying buckets of water, a man dragging a cart with firewood. Tommy watched them, realizing that, in a small, fragile way, his choices had affected lives beyond the soldiers' lines. Each round of artillery, each precise correction, had bought someone a chance to survive, a child to eat, a family to keep hope. By nightfall, tents were pitched, fires crackled, and guards patrolled with a careful vigilance. The village lay calm, but tension hummed beneath the surface, the awareness that danger could return at any moment. Tommy finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. He stared up at the dark sky, constellations blurred by smoke and frost. Somewhere far away, the distant rumble of tanks reminded him that the war was still raging. But for now, a small victory had been claimed, not with a charge or a heroic duel, but with coordination, calm, and quick thinking. In the quiet, he thought of the men who hadn't made it, those who had fallen because they hesitated, because the snow and chaos had overwhelmed them. He thought of the young villagers, their faces pale in the firelight, and he thought of the German soldiers now retreating, unaware that their momentary confusion had been orchestrated by a single radio operator behind a heap of rubble. Tommy felt a strange kind of satisfaction, tinged with exhaustion. He knew that this battle, small, almost forgotten in the grand scale of the war, would never appear in newspapers. There would be no medals, no public recognition. But in the lives he had touched, in the soldiers who survived because of his choices, there was a quiet triumph. A reminder that war wasn't only about brute force. It was about decisions made in the seconds that mattered most. And deep down, he realized that the war, terrifying as it was, had also revealed something unexpected about himself. The power of a clear mind under pressure, the responsibility of action, and the fragile, remarkable impact one person could have when they dared to think fast and act decisively. Dawn crept over the village, painting frost-covered rooftops in pale gold. Tommy was already at his post, radio headset snug, eyes scanning the horizon. Overnight, reports from nearby outposts had come in. German patrols were regrouping, probing, testing defenses. The small battle might have ended, but the war was far from over. Lieutenant Harris walked up beside him, notebook in hand. "The intel you sent last night, it changed how command is positioning the reinforcements.
Without your corrections, the flank would have been exposed. That's why those two squads survived.
Tommy shrugged. I just did the math. Someone had to. But deep down, he knew it was more than numbers. Every adjustment of coordinates, every instruction sent over the crackling radio had created a ripple. Those ripples had shifted the course of the skirmish, giving the Americans a foothold where defeat could have been swift and total. Outside the village, soldiers moved with newfound confidence. The morale boost from surviving a night of chaos was palpable. Men who had been hesitant, fearful of German snipers and hidden artillery, now stepped forward with determination. They trusted Tommy's calculations. They trusted that someone had thought faster, clearer, and smarter than the enemy. And it wasn't just the soldiers who were changing. The villagers too began to emerge from their shells. The women repaired fences, fetched water, and shared meals with the American troops. Children ran cautiously through the streets, playing despite the lingering smell of gunpowder. There was a fragile trust forming, trust born not of victory, but of protection, a sense that someone had intervened in their favor, someone who cared enough to think fast when seconds counted. And Tommy noticed it in small ways. The blacksmith offered to repair rifles for free. A baker brought bread to the front lines. Even the elderly, who had hidden in cellars the night before, nodded politely as he passed. These were tiny gestures, but in the theater of war, small victories were often as meaningful as large ones. Meanwhile, the German soldiers, retreating to the hills beyond the village, were shaken. They had expected an easy skirmish, a quick sweep and a retreat to familiar lines, but the American response, guided by one radio operator's decisions, had disrupted their plans. They moved cautiously, wary, realizing that even minor miscalculations could cost lives. One officer muttered under his breath about the phantom controller, never suspecting that the orchestrator was a single young man crouched behind rubble, headset on, gripping a microphone. By midday, reinforcements arrived, repositioning strategically as Tommy had predicted. The platoon regrouped, and the village remained intact. Soldiers shared glances, a mixture of relief and admiration. Some whispered to each other about the kid at the radio who had turned the tide. It was not heroism in the classic sense. There were no duels, no dramatic charges, but in the logic of war, it had been decisive. Even Tommy felt the change within himself. For the first time in months, he understood the subtle power of observation, anticipation, and clear communication. He realized that quick thinking was not merely survival, it was influence. One small decision had altered the outcome, saved lives, and preserved a piece of civilization amidst destruction. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the platoon gathered in the square. Fires were lit, and for the first time in days, there was laughter. Soldiers shared stories, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes quiet, but always grounding themselves in human connection. Villagers joined where they could, offering tea, a loaf of bread, or simply a smile. Tommy stepped aside, headset off, watching the scene unfold. The war still raged beyond the hills, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, for a few hours, there was peace. And it had been crafted not by overwhelming force, but by a single individual's mind, reacting swiftly, calculating carefully, and trusting that action mattered. In those hours, a transformation rippled, not just across the platoon, but within the hearts of the villagers and even among some younger soldiers who had seen firsthand the weight of responsibility. Tommy's quick thinking had not only preserved life, but it had inspired a subtle courage, a quiet understanding that even in the chaos of war, choices mattered, and human connection could survive. The nights were colder now, the war creeping closer to the edges of the village, yet inside, there was a fragile rhythm. Tommy had become more than a radio operator. He was the silent pivot around which this small unit turned. Soldiers sought his advice, not just for calculations, but for judgment. He could predict patterns, anticipate movements, and relay orders that saved lives. And with every success, the trust between him and the others deepened. Captain Harris pulled him aside one evening. "Kid, I need to tell you something. That move yesterday, coordinating the supply trucks while under fire, was genius. If it weren't for you, half this platoon wouldn't be standing."
Tommy shook his head, trying to shrug off the praise. "I just did what had to be done, nothing fancy." But the truth was undeniable. One mind, thinking fast, had shaped the course of an entire engagement. And more than that, it had created bonds. Soldiers who had been strangers, wary of each other and the unknown, now relied on one another instinctively. Trust wasn't just earned through bravery on the battlefield, it was forged in calculated, deliberate acts that saved comrades in the blink of an eye. Outside the compound, the villagers had begun to open up in ways that were subtle but profound. The baker, old and stooped, had begun leaving fresh bread on the steps near the makeshift barracks, a silent acknowledgement that Tommy and his unit were no longer just intruders, they were protectors. Children, once hiding in fear, now peeked around corners, curious about the young operator who spoke softly into a strange-looking headset, fingers flying over dials and buttons. One afternoon, a young boy, no older than 12, approached Tommy with a sketchbook. "He drew this," he said, holding it out with shaking hands. The sketch was crude but heartfelt. Tommy at his radio station, waves radiating outward like ripples in water. "You saved my brother," the boy whispered. Tommy felt a lump form in his throat. He had done his job, yes, but he hadn't thought about how every call, every decision was touching lives beyond the battlefield. And then there were the soldiers. Harris, always a man of action rather than words, started confiding in Tommy. Minor details about the men under his command, their fears, their losses, their hidden courage. Slowly, a network of understanding formed, built on shared experience and the unspoken knowledge that each life was precious. Tommy noticed the irony. He was just a kid, technically, barely old enough to vote back home, thrust into a war that seemed endless. Yet, in this crucible, he had become indispensable. He had not pulled a trigger, charged to hell, or flown into the fray. But the war bent to his decisions because someone had to think, fast and clearly, when chaos threatened to consume everything. Even the enemy was changing, not morally, not in allegiance, but in reaction. German patrols hesitated, unsure, recalculating after every maneuver Tommy orchestrated. Small victories, precise moves, and timely intelligence forced them into patterns they hadn't expected. It wasn't a sweeping triumph, not yet, but it was survival, and in war, survival often counts as victory. That night, as Tommy wrote in his journal, he didn't focus on the chaos of battle, or the numbers, or the strategy. He wrote about moments that mattered. The boy with the sketchbook, the baker's loaf of bread, a soldier's quiet nod in the dark. He understood something profound. War wasn't just about lines on a map or victories tallied, it was about people. Lives intersecting in fragile, fleeting moments, and a single mind applied with calm and clarity could ripple through all of it, altering outcomes no one could predict. As the firelight flickered across the village square, shadows danced on walls scarred by conflict, and in those shadows, Tommy felt a strange, quiet pride. Not for glory, not for medals, but for the knowledge that his choices, calculated, swift, unheralded, had turned a small battle around. They had preserved lives, built trust, and reminded everyone that even in the midst of war, humanity still mattered. The morning air was thick with tension. Smoke from distant fires hung low over the village, curling through the streets like a warning. Tommy adjusted his headset, fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. Today, everything could change. Every decision he made, every call he relayed would ripple across the battlefield. Reports had come in that a German reconnaissance unit was moving closer than expected. They weren't just probing, they were planning a strike, targeting the supply line Tommy's unit had been protecting. And if they succeeded, the village and everyone in it could be overrun. Tommy took a deep breath and scanned the radio channels. He heard fragments, gunfire in the distance, the sharp commands of his captain, the crackle of static. Timing was critical. A single misplaced instruction could cost lives. "Tommy, status report," Harris barked, eyes scanning the horizon.
"Enemy advancing from the north," Tommy said, voice calm despite the pounding in his chest. "They're moving in small groups, likely aiming for the supply trucks near the east edge of the village. If we can delay them for 15 minutes, the reinforcements will arrive." Harris nodded, and soldiers moved into position. But the Germans were fast, disciplined, and determined. The first skirmish erupted near the granary. Bullets zipped overhead, splintering wood and kicking up dust. Soldiers dove for cover, shouting orders, hearts hammering. Tommy's hands moved over the dials, flipping switches, coordinating radio calls. "Left flank, hold the barn," he called. "Artillery support will hit in 3 minutes." His instructions were precise, every syllable carrying weight. He monitored troop movements, recalculated angles, and predicted enemy maneuvers in real time. Then came a sudden surge. A small German squad had broken through a weak point in the defenses. Panic flickered across the faces of the younger soldiers. Harris glanced toward Tommy. "We need a plan, now." Tommy didn't hesitate. He remembered the maps, the radio codes, and most importantly, the principle that had guided him all along. Think first, act decisively. Divert them toward the abandoned barn. Set the explosives on the north side. When they charge, we hit. Harris's eyes widened. "You sure?" Tommy nodded. "Trust me." The soldiers moved with precision, guided by Tommy's commands. The Germans fell into the trap almost seamlessly. As they charged, explosives detonated, sending a shockwave that threw dust and debris into the air. For a moment, silence fell, only broken by groans and distant gunfire. But the immediate threat had been neutralized. Tommy leaned back slightly, heart racing, sweat stinging his eyes. He realized what had just happened. His quick thinking, his calm under pressure, had prevented a potential massacre. Lives had been saved, not by brute force, but by clarity of mind, speed, and courage under fire. The village breathed again. Soldiers exchanged looks, a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Harris clapped Tommy on the shoulder. "Kid, you just turned this battle around." Tommy didn't smile. Not yet. There was still work to do, still the aftermath, still the wounded to tend to, the villagers to reassure. But inside, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had done more than survive. He had influenced the tide of conflict, even if only a small corner of it, with nothing but quick thinking and unwavering focus. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the village, Tommy sat down by the radio station, running through reports, listening to the soft crackle of static. Around him, soldiers cleaned weapons, patched wounds, and whispered thanks. And in that fragile calm, he understood the deeper truth. War could be brutal, chaotic, and merciless, but clarity, courage, and decisiveness could carve moments of triumph from the chaos. He wrote in his journal that night, "Today I realize the weight of thought. One mind, steady and deliberate, can turn the tide. Not always the strongest or the fastest, but the one who thinks first, acts wisely, and never loses focus." It was more than strategy. It was survival. It was leadership. And it was the moment that would define Tommy, the young radio operator whose quick thinking had turned a small battle around. The battle had ended, but the echoes lingered. Smoke still hung low over the village, and the stench of gunpowder clung to the air. Soldiers moved through the streets, gathering supplies, tending to the wounded, and helping the frightened villagers return to their homes. The sun, now a molten orange, dipped behind the ruins, casting long shadows across broken rooftops and shattered windows. It was a scene both somber and surreal, chaos and calm intertwined in a fragile equilibrium.
Reports continued to crackle through the radio. Units were confirming positions, noting casualties, and sending updates on enemy movements. Tommy relayed each message with precision, every call a thread in the intricate web of coordination that had held the village together. Soldiers who had once doubted the wisdom of a young radio operator now looked to him with respect, even admiration. Corporal Harris, standing nearby with a makeshift bandage around his arm, gave Tommy a nod that said more than words ever could. "You saved us." The villagers began emerging cautiously from their homes. Old men, women, and children stared at the aftermath, wide-eyed and silent. Some held hands tightly, trembling from fear and relief. Others brought water and food to the soldiers, offering quiet gestures of gratitude. Tommy watched as a young girl handed a loaf of bread to a weary soldier. Her eyes met his for a moment, innocent yet knowing.
No words were exchanged, but in that fleeting glance, Tommy understood something profound. The impact of his decisions extended far beyond the battlefield. Every life saved, every action measured, rippled outward in ways he could not fully comprehend. Night fell completely, and with it came a sense of quiet reflection. Tommy walked the perimeter of the village with Harris, the two of them sharing the silence that only comes after survival. "You know," Harris finally said, breaking the quiet, "most people don't realize what happened here today. Not just the battle, but how we got through it." Tommy shook his head, staring at the stars above. "I just did what had to be done. I didn't think about being a hero. I acted." "That's exactly it," Harris replied. "You thought. And that thinking, it saved lives. Not just ours, not just the villagers, but maybe even the whole operation. One small moment of clarity in the chaos. That's rare." The truth of it settled in Tommy's chest like a stone. Battles were not always won by numbers or firepower. Sometimes they were won by the mind, by the ability to stay calm when everything around you screamed panic. Sometimes victory came from understanding the landscape, reading the movements of the enemy, and acting decisively in that fragile moment when hesitation could mean disaster. Over the following days, the village slowly returned to life. Supply lines stabilized, soldiers repaired fortifications, and villagers began clearing debris from their homes. Tommy continued his work at the radio station, but now he moved with the confidence born from experience. Every call he relayed, every order he transmitted, carried the weight of lessons learned in the heat of battle. The men in his unit often spoke of that day with reverence. Stories circulated about the young radio operator whose quick thinking had prevented disaster, whose calm under pressure had given them all a chance to survive. But Tommy remained modest. He never claimed glory. He understood the unspoken truth. Heroism wasn't about recognition. It was about responsibility, about the courage to act decisively when the moment demanded it. And as the years passed, those who had survived would tell the story of the young American radio operator whose quick thinking turned a small battle around. How one person's calm, courage, and clarity in the heat of conflict could make the difference between disaster and survival. In the end, it wasn't just a story about a batter. It was a story about responsibility, about courage, about the human capacity to act wisely when the world seemed intent on chaos. And it remains a lesson for every generation, that even in the darkest moments, one clear mind can change everything.